I tried to find out what really am I doing when I'm adapting a novel. So here we have Günter Grass, say, who lived in the city of Gdańsk during the war, had parents who were half Polish, half German, half the local Kashubians. I mean, a lot of life lived in his mind, and he sat down and to write it down, especially what pushed him, he told me, to write it down was not the story of the little boy, which is his story, even though he was not a dwarf, but it was the story of an uncle of his who always came to the house, whom he suspected to be his mother's lover, and who had disappeared on the first day of the Second World War, when the Polish post office was attacked by the Germans, because he was a Polish post office worker. So he said, I sat down, I felt like this man was knocking at my door, this uncle who was never seen again, his body wasn't found, he just vanished after that September 1st of 1939. And only later came the idea of he should introduce a little boy, and then standing in for himself. And then, he says, came the idea to make him special, I can make him like a dreamlike character and he would not grow up, and so on. So he had taken, if you look up there, his personal experience, real characters out of his family, meaning reality, and he had turned it into fiction. A novel, a story, heroes, dialogue, a dwarf, whatnot, extreme situations. Now, what was I doing with Jean Claude Carriere when we wrote the screenplay? We went out with our screenplay and looked again. We did just the opposite of what Günter Grass had done. We looked for the real places he grew up. He looked for real people who might have inspired him and were similar characters. We did a whole detour to reality before we could bring our screenplay to life in form of a movie that would present itself again as a fiction and something. So it's a continuous back and forth between fiction, reality transformed back into fiction, which is a process, of course, that keeps also your mind busy. To be more concrete, I was not sure I could make this movie. I came to meet Günter Grass on the insistence of the producer, and I said, but we will have to build incredible sets, because the way I imagine from your book, the reality, there had to be huge houses, you know, with this little boy standing underneath, with columns taking it. It's like when I read the novel, I imagine a fantasy world, an extraordinary one. To start with, the drum doesn't even exist. What is this drum? That's another piece of fantasy. And he says, very good. I understand your problems. When I wrote the novel, for each chapter, I started from an object. And of course, the first object was this drum. The drum was nothing else but my typewriter. As I was writing for 3-4 years, all of a sudden I said, what are you doing there? You know, hammering and hammering. And I had the idea of a tin drum. But there is no tin drum in any toy shop in the world, you know, not that kind. So this is how we invented, and I did these little drawings, encouraged that if that's the way Günter Grass did it, I may do it too. As for the sets we need for the movie, these huge constructions, I had been to see Ken Adam in London, you know, the designer of Stanley Kubrick, of the War Room. In Dr. Strangelove, he said, "Oh, I'd love to build you the street as we remember it from the childhood, where you have these huge buildings, they go up, and then you have Atlas carrying the globe, you know, over an insurance building. I'll do you a beautiful set." When we started to budget it, it was more for his set buildings than we had to make the entire movie. Günter Grass said, "Here is an address in Dansk." I went to that street, gray socialism in the buildings. That was the street where he grew up. This was the house where I rang the bell, where he grew up. You see the staircase where Oscar comes down with the drum. You see the door to the bathroom. Behind this door, his mother dies. And on the right side was the entrance to the shop. So I thought, if out of this gray and tiny reality, he could write a novel where we imagine a whole cosmos, then I should be able also, not with Ken Adams' help, to build fantasy sets, but to start from reality and just give it a little push. So the reality, if you want to, is the upper line. That's exactly what the street looked in Danzig, where ultimately we're shooting. In the middle line, you had what our production designer did on his drawing board, how he could dress it. And on the third line, you have how it ultimately looked when we shot it. Not quite as nice as on the drawings. Be aware of production designers. It never looks as good when it's done as it's on their drawings. But anyhow, then comes the art of photography and of color, and it would change. So there again, you have the process. We start from reality to transform it somehow into fiction. Because I think even though I do films that try to treat with reality, I still would like it to look like a movie. I don't want it to look like a documentary. When I went after